Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Daniel fired up his lawnmower to help an elderly neighbor, he didn't expect the HOA from a neighborhood he didn't even live in to call the cops on him. What started as petty complaints turned into a legal war, and by the end, their Queen Karen would be in handcuffs. Daniel Whitaker wasn't the type to seek conflict. At 43, he had built a life of quiet satisfaction. An independent software developer with a love for open spaces, he had recently moved into a charming farmhouse on the edge of town. The property, sprawling and serene, sat well outside the boundaries of the nearest residential development. With 3 acres of land, a detached workshop, and a wide gravel drive that curved around clusters of oak trees, Daniel had finally found the kind of peace he'd been craving for years. No HOA, no nosy neighbors, and certainly no one to tell him how tall his grass should be. His days were a comfortable rhythm of writing code, fixing up the barn, and riding around on his industrial-grade zero-turn mower. The mower, a beast of a machine he'd picked up secondhand from a retiring landscaper, became something of a local fixture. Every few days, he'd drive it to help out his elderly neighbors, cutting overgrown lots, clearing brush, or just tidying up roadside ditches. People waved when they saw him coming, and Daniel always waved back. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he just liked being useful, but not everyone appreciated his presence. Roughly half a mile down the rural road that led past Daniel's property was a gated community called Silver Pines Estates, known for its obsessively manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and an HOA board that believed itself to be the last bastion of order in an increasingly untidy world. Daniel had no ties to Silver Pines. He didn't live there, didn't drive through it, and certainly hadn't agreed to abide by any of its so-called aesthetic standards. Yet somehow, he was about to become public enemy number 1 in the eyes of its self-appointed queen, Karen Ellington, HOA president. And it would all begin with the sound of a lawnmower engine in the wrong place, at the wrong time. It was a sunny Wednesday afternoon when Daniel pulled his mower off the gravel shoulder near Mrs. Halberd's property, just across the road from the outer boundary of Silver Pines Estates. The grass along her ditch had grown unruly, and at 78, she had neither the strength nor the budget to keep up with it. Daniel waved to her as she watched from her porch, started up the mower, and began making clean, precise passes through the knee-high tangle. The rumble of the machine blended into the quiet hum of the countryside. 10 minutes in, Daniel noticed a black luxury SUV pulling up and idling on the opposite side of the street. He didn't think much of it at first. People sometimes slowed to watch him work. But when the door slammed and a woman in a pastel cardigan and oversized sunglasses stormed across the road, he eased back the throttle and cut the engine. She was heading straight for him with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a weapon. "Excuse me," she snapped. "Do you have a permit for that?" Daniel blinked, sweat dripping from his brow. "A permit? For mowing grass?" The woman scoffed. "You're operating commercial machinery within audible range of Silver Pines. That's a violation of our community noise ordinance, and frankly, it's an eyesore." Daniel leaned back on his mower, unsure whether to laugh or be concerned. "Ma'am, I don't live in Silver Pines. I'm helping out my neighbor across the road." "You're within visual influence of our subdivision," she said, like that meant anything. "And this," she gestured to the mower, "doesn't comply with approved landscaping standards. It reflects poorly on the community." "I'm sorry, who are you exactly?" "Karen Ellington, HOA president of Silver Pines Estates." Daniel nodded slowly. "Right. Well, Karen, this is county land. I don't live in your neighborhood. I'm not part of your HOA, and you have no authority here." Karen's expression twisted into a forced smile. "You may think that, but when someone's actions affect the aesthetic and tranquility of our community, we have every right to intervene." He sighed. "I'm mowing grass, not running a circus." Karen didn't reply. Instead, she pulled out her phone and snapped several photos of the mower Daniel and Mrs. Halberd's property. Then she turned on her heel and marched back to her SUV without another word. Daniel restarted the engine, but the irritation lingered. Something about her tone made it clear. This wasn't over. By the following week, Daniel began to realize that his encounter with Karen hadn't simply ended with her dramatic exit. On Monday morning, he received an unexpected visit from a deputy sheriff. The officer, polite but visibly weary, approached Daniel's workshop while he was replacing belts on the mower. "Mr. Whitaker," the deputy asked, eyeing the machine behind him, We've had a few complaints come in about unlicensed commercial landscaping activity on county roads near Silver Pines Estates. Daniel stood wiping his hands on a rag. Let me guess, a complaint came from a woman named Karen Ellington. The deputy gave a tight smile. Can't say, officially, but if you're not charging money for this work, then you're not breaking any laws. Still, I have to file a report since she claims you're endangering residents by operating heavy machinery near a pedestrian route. There's no sidewalk for half a mile in either direction, Daniel muttered. She attached photos. The deputy added, pulling out a file. Inside were printed shots of Daniel on the mower, the vehicle parked off the shoulder, even one where he was handing Mrs. Halberd a bottle of water. Also submitted a formal complaint to the zoning board claiming your mower violates noise ordinances and obstructs the visual cohesion of the community. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. I don't even live there. Yeah, the deputy said with a sigh. That part's unusual. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived, this time from the Silver Pines HOA Legal Committee. It demanded that Daniel cease and desist from operating unauthorized commercial-grade equipment within visible proximity to the Silver Pines community and warned of potential civil action for damaging property values and creating a hostile visual environment. Hostile visual environment? Even Mrs. Halberd, usually unfazed by neighborhood drama, was livid. She called the sheriff on you for helping me cut grass? What is she, the suburban Stasi? Things escalated quickly. Over the next week, Karen and the HOA filed additional complaints, this time with the County Code Enforcement Office, alleging improper fuel storage, environmental violations from mower runoff, and unregistered business activity. Daniel soon had to spend hours pulling permits, writing statements, and explaining that no, he wasn't running a company out of his garage. What had begun as a simple good deed had become a campaign of harassment. And as Daniel watched another county vehicle slow roll past his driveway, he realized this was no misunderstanding. The HOA wasn't just trying to bully him, they were trying to bury him under bureaucracy. But if they thought he'd fold, they didn't know who they were dealing with. Daniel wasn't a litigious man by nature, but he'd spent enough time navigating contracts and digital rights to recognize when someone was abusing the system. After 3 weeks of mounting nonsense, from police visits to zoning reviews and threats of legal action, it was clear that Karen wasn't just throwing a fit. She was orchestrating a targeted harassment campaign under the banner of her HOA's authority. And Daniel was done playing defense. The first thing he did was hire Eva Benton, a local attorney who specialized in property rights and municipal code enforcement. She came highly recommended, and upon hearing the full story, offered a dry chuckle and said, "Oh, I know Silver Pines. This isn't the first time their board tried to play neighborhood dictator." Together, they compiled a full dossier of the HOA's actions. Every letter, every complaint, every agency visit tied directly to Karen's influence. Daniel also began reaching out to neighbors along the road near Silver Pines and quickly uncovered a disturbing pattern. 3 other homeowners, all of whom lived near the HOA boundary but weren't members, had received similar treatment in the past. One had been threatened with lawsuits over the color of his mailbox. Another had been falsely reported for unlicensed tree removal when trimming his own hedges. More telling was the fact that all of them had received eerily similar cease and desist letters, signed not by a lawyer but by Karen herself, on HOA letterhead. Eva's eyebrows raised when she examined the documents. She's not just overreaching, she's impersonating legal authority. That's mail fraud, misuse of civil process, and likely a violation of the HOA's charter. She smiled coldly. We're going to have fun with this. Daniel didn't stop there. He paid for a professional land surveyor to map the actual boundary between his property and Silver Pines. The resulting document clearly showed that he was outside the HOA's jurisdiction by nearly half a mile. He posted a large, not part of Silver Pines HOA sign at the corner of his lot, just to make the point unmissable. Then came the real strike. Ava filed a formal complaint with the state's Attorney General's office alleging HOA overreach, false legal threats, and coordinated harassment. She also sent a warning letter to the HOA's insurer, notifying them of potential exposure due to the actions of their board president. If the HOA board had been casually supporting Karen before, they were now staring down the barrel of real financial and legal consequences. Karen didn't know it yet, but she'd kicked the wrong hornet's nest. Daniel wasn't just going to push back, he was going to dismantle her little empire. piece by entitled piece. The first cracks in Karen's carefully controlled facade appeared at the monthly Silver Pines HOA meeting. It was supposed to be a routine gathering, a chance for the board to scold residents about garbage bins being left out too long and remind everyone to repaint their shutters. But this time, several non-resident property owners had shown up, including Daniel, who stood calmly at the back of the clubhouse room with a thick folder under his arm. His presence caused a ripple. Karen, seated at the head table, froze when she saw him, then quickly forced a smile. "Mr. Whitaker," she said tightly, "I'm afraid this meeting is for HOA members only." "I figured you'd say that," Daniel replied, stepping forward. "Fortunately, I'm not here to participate. I'm here to deliver notice of a legal complaint, multiple actually, against you personally, and your board." Gasps rippled through the audience. Daniel handed a stack of envelopes to each board member, courtesy of Eva Benton's office. "You've been using your HOA status to intimidate and harass people outside your jurisdiction. That ends now." Karen flushed crimson but tried to hold her ground. "This is outrageous. You're not even part of our community." Daniel cut her off. "Exactly, that's the point. And you knew it the whole time." What followed over the next 2 weeks was a slow-motion implosion of Silver Pines leadership. The Attorney General's office launched a formal inquiry, and so did the county commissioner, prompted by a coordinated series of complaints filed by Daniel and the other wrongfully targeted neighbors. The paper trail Karen had left, signed letters, photos, printed violation notices, painted a damning picture. But the real turning point came when a disgruntled former board member came forward with a thumb drive full of internal emails and documents. Contained within were discussions about expanding influence zones, instructions to pressure bordering properties to comply with aesthetic standards, and, most damning of all, direct emails from Karen drafting fake legal letters that she signed and mailed herself. The bombshell landed when county investigators cross-referenced those documents with HOA financial records and discovered unauthorized spending. HOA funds used to hire consultants who were in fact friends of Karen's, and even a mysterious landscaping invoice that corresponded with the week her own backyard was remodeled. Karen was arrested 2 weeks later. It was early morning when the sheriff's department rolled into Silver Pines. Daniel stood at the edge of his driveway sipping coffee as 2 black and white cruisers quietly rolled through the gated entrance. Moments later, Karen was led out of her front door in handcuffs, robe barely tied, sunglasses crooked on her face as she shouted protests at the deputies. "This is a mistake. I was protecting the community. I have rights." "You also have indictments," one of the officers replied dryly. The charges included harassment, filing false reports, misuse of funds, impersonating legal authority, and mail fraud. And once the HOA's insurer was notified of the investigation, the board's remaining members scrambled to distance themselves. 2 resigned immediately. A third attempted to claim he was unaware of Karen's actions, but the email trail said otherwise. Karen's arrest made the local news, and then regional outlets picked it up. The story practically wrote itself. HOA president arrested for trying to control neighborhood she didn't own. Daniel declined interviews but gave a brief written statement. "I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to cut grass in peace." He got more than he bargained for. But now, with Karen's empire crumbling and the HOA in full retreat, Daniel finally saw something he hadn't in weeks: relief. Not just for himself, but for everyone who'd been silently enduring Karen's campaign of control. And he wasn't finished yet. In the weeks following Karen Ellington's arrest, the fallout spread through Silver Pines like a wildfire through dry brush. The once pristine, tightly governed community suddenly found itself leaderless, fractured, and facing both civil and criminal investigations. Residents, many of whom had blindly followed Karen's iron-fisted leadership, were now left reeling. Lawn committee meetings were canceled. Violation notices stopped arriving. For the first time in years, people could breathe without fear of fines for having the wrong shade of beige on their garage doors. Karen's court case moved faster than expected. Facing overwhelming evidence and under pressure from both the HOA insurer and her own legal team, she accepted a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she pled guilty to multiple charges: abuse of authority, filing false legal claims, criminal impersonation, and mail fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 6 months of house arrest, and ordered to pay $75,000 in restitution, split among the 4 property owners she had targeted, Daniel chief among them. But perhaps more satisfying than the court ruling was the civil judgment Daniel and Ava pursued. Their lawsuit against the HOA itself for enabling Karen's behavior uncovered more than just misused funds. It exposed a culture of passive complicity. The court found the HOA board grossly negligent, holding them financially liable. Their liability insurer, now in full damage control mode, agreed to a 6-figure settlement that covered Daniel's legal fees, emotional damages, and an additional punitive amount for the public harassment he endured. Daniel didn't go around gloating or seeking the spotlight, but that didn't stop people from noticing. His quiet resistance and eventual victory made him something of a local legend. The story had gained traction in regional news, and soon, national outlets picked it up under headlines like, "Man wins legal battle against HOA that didn't even govern his property." His calm, grounded demeanor during interviews when he agreed to them only amplified the message. People had rights, even in the face of overreaching organizations trying to push imagined authority onto others. The Silver Pines HOA, once the model of controlled suburban excellence, was placed under court-supervised restructuring. A special committee appointed by the county was tasked with drafting a new charter, one that would explicitly define the HOA's limited jurisdiction and prohibit future overreach. Residents were invited to participate for the first time in years, and they did. Several of them reached out to Daniel directly. They wanted to thank him for standing up when no one else could, for showing them they didn't have to live under Karen's thumb, and for turning what started as a personal attack into a community-wide reckoning. He received letters, cookies, even a hand-painted sign from one of the kids that read, "Thank you for mowing the truth." Strangest of all was when the county commissioner invited Daniel to speak at a local town hall on property rights and HOA reform. At first, he laughed off the idea. "I'm just a guy with a mower," he said, but Eva nudged him into it, and his speech, plain-spoken, heartfelt, and full of quiet conviction, ended in a standing ovation. Daniel didn't let it change him. He still fixed his own fences, still helped Mrs. Halberd trim her hedges, and still rode his mower like a man enjoying the small freedoms that made life worth living. But something had shifted. The man who only wanted peace had become a symbol of standing one's ground, not just on a property line, but in the face of unjust authority, and, for once, justice had cut clean. Months passed, and life around Daniel Whitaker's quiet farmhouse began to return to the kind of normal he'd originally hoped for. The courtroom drama faded from the headlines, the Silver Pines HOA rebranded under new leadership, and Karen Ellington, once a queen bee with a clipboard, was now a cautionary tale whispered about over backyard fences. Her house went up for sale shortly after her sentencing, and within weeks, a young couple with 2 golden retrievers moved in. They brought cookies to Daniel on their first day. Daniel's days were simple again. He still worked from home, still walked his land every morning with a mug of coffee in hand, and still helped his neighbors without fanfare. His mower was freshly tuned and outfitted with a small GoPro that he never mentioned, but which quietly captured any future nonsense for legal backup. Not that he expected trouble anymore. People knew better now. Every so often, strangers would drive by slowly, recognizing the curve of his driveway from the local news segment. Some waved. A few stopped to ask for advice. Others sent emails after finding his story on a community blog, asking how to handle their own petty HOA tyrants. Daniel didn't see himself as a hero, but he responded when he could, usually with practical tips and a few choice words. Document everything. Know your rights. Don't back down. He'd even started writing occasional posts under the pseudonym The Mower Rebellion, half tongue-in-cheek, half genuinely helpful. The small blog caught traction faster than he expected. Property owners from as far as Arizona and Georgia reached out to share stories eerily similar to his. Overzealous HOA presidents, fake citations, petty power grabs. Daniel would nod quietly, sip his coffee, and realize just how widespread the problem had become. But more than anything, what changed was his sense of place in the community. The man who once wanted nothing more than to be left alone had become something more, A trusted neighbor, a local voice of calm resistance, and proof that quiet people can make a lot of noise, especially when someone tries to cut into their freedom with a clipboard and a bad attitude. And every time he fired up his mower, the engine's steady growl sounded just a little more like victory. A year after the showdown with Silver Pines, Daniel stood at the edge of his property, watching a group of kids race up and down the dirt trail near the old oak grove. Their laughter echoed faintly, carried on the same breeze that rustled through the tall grass he'd just finished trimming. The sun was setting over the hills, casting long golden shadows across the field. Peace, hard-earned and well-kept, had settled in for good. The HOA had fully restructured under a new, transparent board. Their new charter strictly limited jurisdiction, and membership became optional for border properties. Daniel had even been invited, as a gesture of goodwill, to consult on the draft. He politely declined, but offered a few tips over coffee with one of the new board members, Karen. She'd vanished from public life. Her restitution payments arrived like clockwork, handled by a law firm now, but she was never mentioned by name anymore. Just a lesson people had learned the hard way. Daniel's blog, The Mower Rebellion, had grown beyond his expectations. It had become a community in itself. Hundreds of readers, dozens of success stories. A retired veteran in Michigan beat his HOA in court using one of Daniel's checklists. A widow in Texas shared a video of her finally tearing down a mandatory privacy fence she'd never agreed to. And Daniel. He was still mowing, still fixing his own tools, still waving to neighbors. But now, when people saw him coming, they didn't just see a man with a mower. They saw the man who reminded everyone that property lines weren't just on paper. They were meant to be respected.